Jerry Diamond with How to Get Out of Babylon, and I'm reading the A.T. Hagan's We Interrupt This Program and recording check 1, 2, 3 and all that good stuff. Big Stick. John came in from the barn with the dawning, having fed the goats, chickens, and horse. It had been his night to sleep out, so he headed for the bathroom to clean up. He and his dad had set up a comfortable enough situation in the feed room, but after a night out there, Ann always said he came in smelling like a goat. Take a shower, smells like a good idea to me. The power was staying on more often than not, which allowed everyone to more or less reestablish their accustomed hygienic habits. The family was going to the morning services at Archer, so this meant thoroughly scrubbing off the barn smell and a good shave. He briefly considered just letting it grow out, but the last time he'd grown a beard, it had taken months before it began to look good. And now that he was an officer of the law, it probably wouldn't do to go about looking scruffy. Oh, yeah, I should shave this off. Right? With no way of knowing when they'd be able to buy more, Anne often reminded everyone to be as conservative as possible with the soap and shampoo. Well, at least we're not short on water, he mused as he stepped into the shower. Even if we have to boil it on the wood stove, we won't be short on water for a long, long time. The rain had stopped early yesterday morning, but by mid-afternoon the precipitation was falling once again, and the weather folks said it would continue for the foreseeable future, with increasing breaks in the rainfall and clouds as the last of the impact weather gradually faded into the normal late summer Florida thunderstorms. He dressed in loose trousers, sneakers, and a pullover shirt. His church clothes would go into a dry bag to be tied on the back of his bike, and they'd all change there. Miguel said many people were doing this now since few had gasoline to drive to church, which meant getting wet in the rain as they walked, biked, or rode a horse into town. The church took it in stride and provided gender-specific rooms for the purpose. Unlike Target today, attendance had been steadily rising since the impact. To be expected, of course. There's no atheists in foxholes, nor in the apocalypse, or whatever passes for it. Teotwaki. Yeah, that's definitely not true. I mean, yeah, it's going to get weird. With a 10-mile bike ride ahead, in addition to the usual day's labors, Heather and Melinda had made up a big breakfast of grits, eggs, milk, tang, and coffee. Mel did pretty well for a 10-year-old in rustling up some simple meals, but since having moved in with them, Heather was really starting to blossom, both in the kitchen and elsewhere. Lack of responsibility and accomplishment, he thought to himself. Kids need to feel like they're an important part of something, not just a family appendage. Here she's got chores, important ones, just like Mel does, and she gets recognition for them when they're done well. Buying her expensive toys and sending her off to camp doesn't substitute for that. After the breakfast dishes had been cleaned up, the family broke out their bikes and mounted up. Robert would be staying home. He hadn't attended services since John was a boy and would be disking up the garden preparatory to working it over with the rototiller. After church and the market, the family would be working in the garden or raking up mulch. No longer a pleasant hobby, gardening was now about to become a serious business, and success or failure could mean the difference in making it through winter well-fed or malnourished. After the events of the previous day, it felt good to burn energy. He'd had such an adrenaline rush after their near brush with pitched battle that he'd had trouble getting to sleep last night. On the way in, John noted a couple of blow-down trees that he'd see about cutting for firewood. If the power stayed on regularly, their need for wood would be fairly small, but after the last 3 weeks, he'd decided that henceforth they would keep at least a year's supply of seasoned wood on hand. The regulatory authorities were still discussing power rationing, and the winter was likely to be a cold one. He was never again going to be entirely comfortable about being dependent on miles of copper cable. Okay, whatever, steel cable, and a generation plant at the other end to keep the family warm. The rest of the trip was uneventful, even though it seemed to John that quite a lot of folks waved at them on the way in, and an extraordinary number of people shook his hand as they dressed and went into the church. Why on earth is everyone being so gregarious? He asked Anne. You'd think I'd hit the lottery or something. With a wry smile, she replied, well, it couldn't have anything to do with the fact that you're the local hero now, would it? And poked him in the ribs. Hero, he said with an incredulous tone. Get on with you. I nearly got everyone's asses shot off yesterday. We could all have been killed. I half expected them to throw rocks at me this morning. But we didn't get killed, Anne persisted, and the army isn't going to come in and take everyone's food now, and that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't stood up to them and then got everyone organized so we'd be ready when they came back. You gave these people at least the illusion of still having some power and control in their lives at a time when everything seems to be completely out of control. Real or not, they think you're responsible for that. Why else do you think the sheriff made you the local constable? That reminds me, you and I have to talk about this lawman thing. Here comes Mel and Heather. We'd better go sit down. Lisa said she'd save us some places. The familiar routine of the service was comforting, as was the sound of the church organ. It had been a while since John had attended services, but it was starting to come back to him. He sang softly as he found that he'd forgotten the words to many of the hymns and had to resort to reading them from the hymnal. Just as well, he thought, since I can't carry a tune in a bucket. The opening hymns and prayer the pastor stepped up to the podium and began his sermon. A little short on commas in here. The morning's topic was about faith and resolve, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming opposition, and it felt to John that the pastor looked at him far more often than anyone else, and he shrank into himself. Eventually he segued into a bit of hellfire and brimstone, and Anne whispered into his ear, I think he's really a repressed Baptist. When a boy of about 11 or 12 came slamming through the doors behind them, his feet slapped loudly as he ran up the center aisle, and the pastor stopped in mid-sentence when the boy approached him. He bent over, and the youngster whispered animatedly into his ear. A look of gravity crossed the man's features, and he stood, then walked over to the organist and bent over to speak to her. She stood and went behind the organ to the sound system controls, and the congregation could hear her adjusting the controls. And then the sound of a radio tuner came from the overhead speakers, finally settling on a station in mid-sentence. That's 3 nuclear detonations in the Straits of Taiwan. The Japanese government reports over its national radio that nuclear detonations have been detected in the Taiwanese Straits and indicates that they are believed to be a result of U.S. naval attacks on the Chinese Navy, which is once again attempting to land troops on the island. The pastor stepped up to the sound system and turned the volume down to a background level. Stepping up to the podium, he said, let us pray. Overhead they could hear the bell begin to toll.